In terms of gender, anthropologists in the 100-year ago days were first interested in issues of kinship and relatedness. They thought that they could tell a lot by different societies being able to tell who was related to whom and different terms that you would have for that. And in some versions of this class, I make you read chapter 9, kinship, family, and marriage, before we do gender, because in some ways people were talking about that before they got into the gender stuff, just the kinship stuff. But in this class, we haven't done that yet, but that was the first thing they had. And what these early anthropologists found out there was kind of that people did kinship and marriage and family in all kinds of different ways. And it was a little bit confusing, you might say, because people at the time felt that everybody was biologically determined to do families the same way, and they found a bunch of different ways to do family. And don't take this the wrong way, but if you think about things that you look around and you're like, whoa, people are doing that? That's so weird. Most of the things that we're doing today, if you look back in time or across different cultures, they've been doing something weirder. So if people think something like sex change operations are strange, people have been doing weird stuff like that for a long time in different societies, stranger than that. So it was eye-opening for people to look around the world at what other people were doing. We've talked about the early anthropologists, Margaret Mead, Ruth Benedict, students of Franz Boas, who in some ways popularized or put these things out there on a larger scale. And they were early advocates for how people could be different in different societies. For example, Margaret Mead in her book, Coming of Age in Samoa, was all about different expectations that people had of these girls and how they were so different in Samoa than they were in the United States. Margaret Mead and Ruth Benedict were both married to, and had, well, you had to have a opposite sex marriage in those days, but they were also involved in a long-term same-sex relationship. And they were very interested in this idea of different kinds of gender and sexuality, and also neither of them really had a huge permanent academic position, in part because they were women. So they were very interested in these things. But it wasn't until maybe the 1970s and 1980s when feminists and feminist anthropology comes along and look back at some of this kinship data and stuff that people had gathered earlier and started to rework it and tell us that, in fact, the things that people might have considered weird or different were not just curiosities. They weren't just things that you file away in your field report, that you actually could look at them as a different way to organize society. And so it meant that our way of organizing society might not be the natural way. And so one of you was surprised that the idea of gender and gender came about so late in anthropology in the 1970s or 1980s. It isn't that people were talking about it, but they weren't using the same terminology, and they weren't necessarily coming at it from the same perspective. For that, in some ways, we can thank the feminists who helped us a lot in understanding these different social possibilities and also looking at the way that societies were organized as a way of organizing power within a society. So some of these anthropologists look back at the studies that were done, for example, by many men and realize that they were going into these places and being guys talking to guys, and they weren't getting at the power dynamic within a society. So in the last few classes, I claim that the biggest moment in anthropology was when anthropologists figured out that our learned behavior, our culture, was a much more important idea than the physical so-called race differences. And that people of the same phenotype, or what we might consider the same race, could have very different social behaviors and cultures, or that people of different races and phenotypes could share a culture. this is also the biggest moment. It wasn't just the anthropologists who said it, and so that's why I'm saying that it's around anthropology. But the idea here is that gender, which are all those social meanings and expectations that we have of people based on what we believe they are, is more important for how we behave and our social roles than biological sex. And so what we are in fact doing here is introducing two different terms: gender, to refer to the social meanings and expectations, and sex, to refer to biological, all those hormones and physiology and things. I want to be careful here because this has been wildly misinterpreted. In the same way that the social construction of race has been misinterpreted with the idea that, oh, do you mean everybody's just the same? No, nobody's saying there aren't biological sex differences or that people don't differ biologically. So what we're saying is that there are social expectations that are attached to those biological differences that then end up being very influential in people's lives. But we're not saying that there's no such thing, there's no difference. That's misinterpretation of this. You have to be careful. Ethnicity becomes a euphemism for race. So people just use ethnic terms instead of racial terms, but keep their same ideas. In the world today, people just use gender when sometimes they maybe should use the word sex. My best example of this now, the gender reveal party. This is what they're called. Now these refer to, they've taken an ultrasound of the infant and they figured out the biological sex. So actually, these should not be called gender reveal parties. They should technically be called sex reveal parties.
So true.
However, it probably wouldn't be the same people who went to these go to them today, or they might be expecting something different, or you might get a different audience if you put out a sign that said sex reveal party today. But technically, gender is the social expectations that you have. Now, they are revealing their social expectations because if all the pink confetti is going to come out of a cannon without burning a forest down, then that is something that is revealing how we get these things attached to us. So just be very careful here because in popular use, this has slipped. And in fact, one of you in your web comment did this slippage exactly the way that we don't want to do it. You see what happens here? How to determine the gender of an individual. And then the quote is 3 primary factors generally being considered in determining biological sex. See, slipping there. So the gender is the social expectations. That is not, it's often attached to the biological sex, but that's not what we're trying to determine. We're not determining gender from genitalia, as much as some people would like to. Yikes. All right. So one of the things is, it is true that among human beings, there is sexual dimorphism. Again, nobody's trying to say that there are no sex differences between human beings. On average, for example, men are heavier than women, taller than women, etc., all these things. And there's different characteristics, physical characteristics, but there's also a continuum of characteristics. So that it's not true that if you're a man, you're automatically going to be bigger and taller than all the women. All of these things exist on a continuum. And when we compare average heights or average weights or average strength, it's an average, and there's going to be differences across. It is safe to say that what we have found is that the biology of sex is a lot messier than we once believed it was. There is still sexual dimorphism, but the idea that chromosomes and the hormonal stuff are always aligned is not as true as we once thought it was. So there are lots of people who have chromosomal, we might consider abnormalities or differences that don't even know they're there. And there's different ways that biology is more complicated than we once thought it was. Mostly though, what we want to talk about here is all the things that we do to attach difference onto the people we consider to be different. We consider the cultural construction of gender. When do we start doing this? When do we start culturally constructing gender onto people? She wouldn't have just thrown her into the mix and given her the same haircut. Probably not, right? And I would say that even if she did, what is going to happen when you four walk out into the world with the same haircut? It's not just the parent. So even if you try as a parent to do everything the same, there's all these expectations that we have of the way people should behave, which extends beyond the parents. So they've done these great experiments with babies. With babies, often you can't tell what they are. They just look all wobbly and stuff. So you take a baby and you dress it in blue and you give it to somebody and they're like, hey, look at this boy. And psychologists have done these experiments where if they tell the person it's a boy, they'll start bouncing it around, throwing it up in the air, playing football with it, doing all this boy stuff, talking to it and boy talk. But if they take the same baby, put some pink on it, and tell the person it's a girl, they'll all be cooing and juggling and patting it on the head. So the same person, the same biological person can actually have very different expectations based on this. And it starts really early. One of the things Guest brings up is how people are funneled into different sports. Used to be, we'd also have different regimes for nutrition, feed them differently. And so the idea was that you wanted to build muscle if you were a boy, but not if you were a girl. Hopefully this doesn't happen as much, but it's still there. And so one of the things that people talk about, again, is this idea that gender is also, in some ways, a performance, something you perform and you get rewarded for if you do a good performance, or you get penalized if you do a bad performance. There was an article that I actually gave you. It was about female surgeons and how in some ways they would be, if they said male doctors, male surgeons would throw what they called a doctor fit and be like, I need a scalpel, I need this. And the nurses would jump to attention. But if a female surgeon did the exact same thing, she'd be called words that start with a B, because it's seen as a bad thing to do. So in some ways we are rewarded for or penalized for our performance of gender. Now, what we have discovered anthropologically is that there is actually a wide range of gender expectations. In some societies, you want girls to have their hairs in buns, and in other societies not, and that's, maybe we should go with something like weaving, for example. Weaving is one of those things that in some societies will be done only by women and considered to be only women can do that. But in other societies it's done only by men. And so you'll go from one society to the other and they'll be like, no, only men can weave. Women don't know how. So we have this wide range. We have that this differs cross-culturally, and even within the same society, there can be different expectations for what you should do as a girl or a boy. We also see that it varies historically. So I've been talking about blue for boys and pink for girls. If my history is right, about 100 years ago, it was actually the opposite, because boys were supposed to be on their way to having the color red, which was seen as fiery and masculine. So they'd be dressed in pink, whereas girls were supposed to be subdued, blue. So they'd be dressed more in blue. So this can differ even in our own society over time. Now, one of the interesting things about this is that if gender is a social expectation, and it is not necessarily equivalent to biological sex differences, does that mean that you could have more than two social genders? It's complicated, but in some ways, they have formed a third gender category. Now, they will often try, or in some ways, to do certain things with their biological sex, but not necessarily. So there's a number of examples of this. Two spirits. Yeah, the idea of a two-spirit person. Now, this is somewhat controversial in that there's not one word or terminology for this across Native societies. But in many Native American societies, there was this idea that there were people who had both spirits. And it wasn't necessarily that they were biologically different. It was that they were blessed in some ways, cursed with being able to do special roles or have both spirits inside them. Now, this was in some ways, we have to be careful. A lot of people have tried to perhaps romanticize this idea. And there are many different societies where you have three or more socially different gender roles. And in this film that was called Two Spirits, they said that there are hundreds of societies. What I want to be careful about here is that oftentimes the people in these societies are not necessarily seen, they might be themselves subjects of prejudice and misunderstanding. So sometimes in our society, we have looked at these societies as, oh, isn't it great they can have more than two genders? It's not necessarily, we shouldn't celebrate or romanticize, but we do want to know that that can exist. Now, one of the things that we never perhaps want to lose sight of is how gender is connected to power. So this is one of the other questions that some of the feminists were asking, is this idea of why is it that in so many societies there is a male dominance and you see women at the bottom of society? The anthropologist Sherry Ortner had an interesting idea about this. And her idea was, in this logical language, that in many societies, men are associated with culture, going outside the home and doing politics and economics and that stuff, whereas women are associated with nature, breastfeeding, menstruation, all those kinds of things. So what she was saying is that man is to culture as woman is to nature, and that was why there was widespread male dominance, is because culture was accorded primacy over nature. Now, this is an interesting idea. It was a fascinating idea about different societies, and in some societies this seemed to work pretty well, but it didn't actually work in all different societies. And in some ways, we might say is what we needed was more complexity, or to use a different word, intersectionality between what was going on with women and class or ethnicity or international stuff. And so, for example, there's a really interesting example at the very end of the chapter about Taiwanese women who hire Filipino and Indonesian women to do housework for them so that they can themselves rise into the middle class. You had women going and being transnational migrants into Taiwan. We're not the only place that has migrants. And then using their incomes from working as domestic workers to support their own families back home. So again, it speaks to this multifaceted dynamic. So whenever you're talking about gender and power, it is not simply, again, that all men are dominating all women. It's going to be complicated by relationships of race, ethnicity, and class. Now, there's a couple other interesting examples here of stereotypes we have about gender which appear in our own society, like the idea of the egg and the sperm, which is an extremely famous article by Emily Martin from about 30 years ago, but it's been reprinted multiple times. I actually thought of giving it to you, but it's a little bit harder to read than what Guest summarizes. Yeah, this was a super interesting study because she just went into regular biology textbooks, and there'd be all this imagery of these aggressive, fast-moving sperms swimming up there and out competing each other, and this egg just being there like la-di-da. And it doesn't actually even describe the biological process, but it was so ingrained, and you see how these ideas about gender get into even our so-called scientific descriptions. The other thing that Guest talks about is the idea of hunting and gathering. And this happens a lot even in anthropology, where we should know better, where we assign hunting as a male activity and gathering as a female activity, and then we say, everything comes from that. And it is true that in general, a lot of the world's hunting has been done by men, but it is not true that women are absent from that. And it is not true that men are absent from things like gathering. And so recently in Anthropology, there was a whole volume of work. It was called Woman the Hunter, the Archaeological Evidence. And there it was. And then, as I reposted, these papers are going to break the internet. I know, a biological anthropologist. What do you think? Did we break the internet?
No, I didn't hear about it.
You didn't hear about it. Now, I tried to break the internet. There I am. There's my reposting and my liking, but it did not break the internet. The internet has been broken, it is true, but by a bunch of freaks. So it wasn't the good stuff. It wasn't the good stuff that has broken the internet. So we end up here in an interesting position where anthropology does know a lot about gender, a lot about sex differences and how we should consider those, but these have not exactly been translated onto popular culture or not being absorbed in the world out there. In fact, one might say the opposite is happening, but we'll keep trying.